At number 10, Child's Play. Okay, so the doll that inspired Child's Play wasn't as scary looking as Chucky, but the story that goes along with him is definitely spooky. It goes back to 1909 when painter and author Robert Eugene Otto claimed that one of his servants put a voodoo curse on his childhood toy, Robert the Doll. Apparently this female servant had been abused by his family. This was, of course, at the time when slavery was common. So she put a curse on Robert to get back at the family. Robert the Doll put a sort of spell on Otto, and Otto would talk to him like he was a friend, and his parents would often hear him having conversations with himself. The scary thing is, Otto's parents heard the replies from Robert that were made in a completely different voice. But that's not all. Robert would move around on his own from room to room. Otto would always blame Robert when furniture would get knocked over or when misfortune struck the family. Otto's parents would also wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of Otto screaming, and when they went to check on him, they saw Robert the Doll by his bedside and all the furniture in his room tossed around. Robert the Doll was eventually banished to the attic of Otto's home until Otto's death in 1974, when a new family moved in. The home's new owners also claimed that Robert the Doll would cause strange incidents. If you're interested, you can actually go and see Robert. He's on display at the Key West Fort East Martello Museum. I probably won't be seeing him anytime soon. At number 9, Open Water. Open Water is a film about an American couple who were abandoned by accident in shark-infested waters during their Bahamas vacation. It was an amazing film that was shot with handheld cameras on a tight budget. Open Water is actually based on the story of Tom and Eileen Lonergan, American tourists who disappeared off Australia's Great Barrier Reef in January of 1998. They spent years traveling the world, but before they returned home, they wanted to visit the Great Barrier Reef. They took a day trip on a passenger boat where a crew would take them on 3 separate dives. And on the third dive at around 3 p.m., they dove down together and were last spotted swimming about 12 meters down. When they came back up, the passenger boat had left without them. The danger of being left in the middle of the ocean is not necessarily drowning or sharks, it's dehydration. A day later, on another boat tour, a diver found 6 weights on the bottom. But still, the crew had no idea they left Tom and Eileen, who might have still been alive at that point. Several months later, a fisherman 100 miles north of the dive site found a dive slate scribbled with the words, "Monday, January 26, 1998, 8 a.m. To anyone who can help us, we have been abandoned on Agincourt Reef by MV Outer Edge. Please help us, come to rescue us before we die, help." Oh jeez. Over the following months, other belongings including Eileen's wetsuit, fins, and dive jackets were found. The couple didn't die by shark attack like the couple in the film Open Water. Instead, they likely died from a combination of dehydration and drowning. In case you're wondering, what happened to Tom and Eileen sparked international outrage. No one even knew they were missing until Tom's wallet and their passports were found on the boat 2 days later. Regardless, it was by most accounts an accident. An accident that inspired the 2004 film Open Water. At number 8, Psycho. Alfred Hitchcock's classic horror Psycho from 1960 is one of the best thriller movies of all time. It was based on a novel of the same name written by Robert Bloch. And the main character in Psycho, Norman Bates, was actually loosely based on real-life psychopath Ed Gein, the notorious Wisconsin murderer and grave robber. The atrocities committed by Ed Gein earned him the nickname the Mad Butcher of Plainfield. That's a nice one. And that wasn't a nickname given lightly. Gein murdered 2 women and dug up dozens of bodies from several local graveyards. He took the remains of those bodies and decorated his house with items made from bones and skin. Gein was eventually caught and was found guilty but legally insane. He was sent to live out the rest of his life in psychiatric institutions, and he finally passed away at age 77 at the Mendota Mental Health Institute in 1984. There were a couple similarities between Norman Bates and Ed Gein. Both had obsessions with their mothers, and both their houses contained sealed off shrines to their dead mothers, and both of them also enjoyed wearing women's clothing. But the main difference between Bates and Gein is that Gein wasn't actually a serial killer. He only killed 2 people and desecrated a bunch of graves. Bates, on the other hand, murdered around 20 people. The more you know. At lucky number 7, The Shining. So The Shining is one of my favorite movies of all time because Jack Nicholson, duh. But yeah, that hotel, it was inspired by a real hotel that's said to be haunted even to this day. It's called the Stanley Hotel. It's a haunted resort in the state of Colorado. The Shining is the story of a hotel caretaker who's driven insane by evil spirits. But you know what? As if that isn't already scary enough, the real story is a lot scarier. There are 142 rooms in this hotel, but one room has a terrible history. Room 217. Room 217. Room 217 used to belong to a chambermaid, Mrs. Wilson, who is spending eternity cleaning up the room that she's trapped in. Guests who stayed in the hotel report that they've been terrorized by strange incidents. People report waking up to the sensation of something poking them in the ribs if their room is messy. Stephen King himself is also said to have spent a night in room 217 while he was battling alcoholism. He apparently had a terrifying nightmare that his son was being chased down the hall by a possessed fire hose. It was this stay in the hotel that inspired Stephen King to write the book The Shining, which is about an alcoholic writer who spends the winter being driven crazy by spirits in a haunted hotel. At number 6, The Girl Next Door. The film is based on a novel by Jack Ketchum that follows the story of a man named David, who recalls memories from his childhood about a pair of orphan girls who was sent to live with their aunt. The orphans are tortured and degraded at the hands of their family members. All the while, David struggles to decide if he should intervene. Unfortunately, The Girl Next Door is actually based on a true story. 16-year-old Sylvia Likens was held captive by her caregiver, Gertrude Baniszewski. For 3 months, Gertrude, her children, and other kids in the neighborhood abused and tortured Sylvia until she died from her injuries. Eventually, Gertrude, her eldest daughter Paula, her son John, and 2 kids from the neighborhood were tried and convicted in May of 1966 of neglecting, torturing, and eventually killing Sylvia. The counsels of the defendants called the case the most diabolical to ever be presented before a court or jury. To this day, the torture and murder of Sylvia Likens is the worst crime ever to be committed in Indiana. Halfway there now, at number 5, The Hills Have Eyes. Okay, so I definitely didn't know that The Hills Have Eyes was based on a true story, or a legend that's said to be based on a true story. The Hills Have Eyes is a story about a family whose car breaks down in the desert. While they're stranded, they're targeted by a group of cannibalistic mutants. How could cannibalistic mutants be real? Well, have you ever heard of Sawney Bean? The legend of Sawney Bean is one of Scotland's most shocking legends. Alexander Sawney Bean was the head of a 45-member family in Scotland back in the 16th century. He left home with a woman named Agnes Douglas, who was accused of being a witch. Neither of them were a fan of honest labor, and they were said to have robbed and cannibalized an innocent victim. They sought refuge in a coastal cave where they remained for 25 years in hiding. The cave was very deep and was blocked by water during high tide, so it was very difficult to find and very difficult to enter. The couple bore 8 sons and 6 daughters, who then had incestual relationships, and they bore 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters. The clan were said to have survived by ambushing passers-by at night and murdering them. The bodies would then be taken back to their cave, where they were eaten. Yummy! Sometimes body parts washed up on shore. This legend is supposed to be fictional, but many experts believe it was based on a real story. Wes Craven used the legend of Sawney Bean as his inspiration for his 1977 film The Hills Have Eyes. In at 4, The Silence of the Lambs. This to date is one of my favorite Anthony Hopkins films, and that's saying a lot. Hopkins is a legend. The Silence of the Lambs revolves around a cannibal named Hannibal Lecter. No one knew that the character was based on a real person until 2013, when the 25th anniversary of The Silence of the Lambs was released. Hannibal Lecter was based on an actual doctor from Mexico, Alfredo Bali Trevino, a surgeon who was convicted of murdering and chopping up his gay lover. Thomas Harris, who wrote the book that the movie is based on, actually met Trevino in the 60s while he was working on a story for a magazine, and he managed to score an interview with him after he performed life-saving surgery on one of the inmates. So he killed his lover for one of 2 reasons. 1, he found out he was leaving him, or 2, he refused to pay back the money that was owed. Either way, Trevino ended up in prison, and his murder was categorized as a crime of passion. He injected a drug into his lover's body, dragged the body into a bathtub, slit its throat with a scalpel, and drained the blood. Afterward, he sliced up the body and stuffed the pieces into a box. Harris described Trevino as someone who had a certain elegance about him, which is pretty interesting because the guy chopped up his lover's body. But that definitely speaks to Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of him. Interestingly, after serving 20 years, Trevino was released in the year 2000 and continued to practice medicine, providing medical care for the poor until his death in 2009. Getting close now, at number 3, A Nightmare on Elm Street. Okay, so Freddy Krueger's freaky face wasn't based on a real life person, so you can just settle down. But A Nightmare on Elm Street was inspired by a terrifying true story. The movie revolves around a terrifying villain, Freddy Krueger, who's the spirit of a serial killer who uses a gloved razor hand to kill his victims in their dreams, which causes their deaths in the real world as well. Wes Craven said he was inspired by an LA Times article about a family that survived the killing fields in Cambodia. The family made it to the United States, but the boy was haunted by nightmares, likely fueled by traumatic events. The boy told his parents that he was afraid of something that was chasing him in his dreams, so he refused to sleep for days at a time. Of course, your body won't allow you to stay awake for days at a time, so eventually the boy fell asleep, but his parents awoke to a scream in the middle of the night. They ran to check on their son, but by that time it was too late. The boy died in the middle of a nightmare. Bro. The boy had died from sudden unexpected death syndrome, a condition that affects young Hmong males and Filipinos. It claims anywhere from 43 to 100 victims per year. Basically, victims die of fright from their own belief of what happens in their dreams. This is where Wes Craven got his idea for a nightmare that can kill. Almost there now, at number 2, Scream. It isn't a Halloween month without Scream, a slasher movie that took a dark humor approach to tell the true story of the Gainesville Ripper, aka Danny Rolling. The screenplay for the films was written by Kevin Williamson, an actor actor who was captivated and horrified after reading about the tragic events that took place during the summer of 1990 at the University of Florida. Over the course of 3 nights, Danny Rolling murdered 5 students. He broke into the apartment of freshman roommates aged 18 and 17 and stabbed them to death before putting their bodies in sexually suggestive positions. The next day, he did the same thing to another victim, only this time he cut off her nipples, severed her head, then placed her head on a shelf so it looked at the body. That's dark, bro. Would not have wanted to come across that crime scene, let me tell you. 2 days later, he struck again, killing 2 roommates, a man and a woman aged 23. The murders took a toll on the community. Universities closed for the week, students took turns at night keeping watch, but Danny Rolling didn't end up killing again. Police didn't figure out it was Rolling until a year later, and by that time he was already in jail for an unrelated burglary charge. He was eventually sentenced to death, but during his court appearances, Rolling would sing love songs to his fiancée, Sandra London. He also sang just before he was executed 15 years later in 2006. And at number 1 on our list, The Exorcist. This is the scariest film on this list in my opinion. And don't come for me in the comments, but I was truly disturbed after I watched The Exorcist, so maybe I'm a little biased. But The Exorcist is based on the real-life exorcism of Roland Doe. Back in the 1940s in suburban Washington, D.C., a 13-year-old boy was traumatized over the loss of his beloved Aunt Harriet. His aunt was a spiritualist who taught him how to use a Ouija board. Before his aunt died in 1949, Roland started experiencing strange things. He was haunted by the sounds of water dripping, scratching sounds coming from the walls, and his mattress would move on its own. His family consulted experts, doctors, and psychiatrists, and their local Lutheran minister. None of them could help. Their minister suggested they seek out the help of a Catholic priest, Father E. Albert Hughes, who got the permission to perform an exorcism on Roland. But the exorcism was cut short when Roland broke off a piece of the spring from his mattress and sliced the priest across the shoulders with it. A few days later, strange scratches appeared on the boy's body that spelled the word Louis, indicating the family had to go to St. Louis in order to save their son. They sought the help of family members who knew 2 priests, who performed another exorcism on Roland. During it, the men gathered had witnessed scratching on the boy's body and the mattress moving around violently. Roland was also in a trance-like state, during which he would utter strange sounds in a guttural voice. The 2 priests continued the exorcism night after night until one night, Roland urinated all over his bed and started cursing at the priests. His parents took him to the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis, where finally, the Monday after Easter, Roland awoke with seizures, yelling at the priests, "Satan would always be with you." The priest adorned him with holy relics and objects, and at 10:45 p.m., the priest called on Saint Michael to expel Satan from Roland's body. 7 minutes later, Roland woke up from his trance saying he's gone. Roland went on to live a completely normal life after this, and there were no other documented incidents or behavior. The cool thing is you can actually go to the staircase, the famous staircase from The Exorcist that the priest falls down at the end of the movie. Yeah, it's in Georgetown, Washington. I've been there, no biggie.
In at number 10, The Conjuring. This supernatural horror film directed by James Wan was the very beginning of what they called the Conjuring universe. You see, Ed and Lorraine Warren were real-life paranormal investigators, and this universe sort of follows their real-life terrifying encounters throughout their career. One of their most famous cases was at a farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island. A husband and his wife, along with their 5 daughters, began to notice very strange things not too long after they moved in. It started with small objects appearing in different parts of the home to small piles of dirt just randomly in the middle of the floor. However, it wasn't long before things got far beyond their control. Allegedly, the home had previously been owned by the same family for 8 generations. Upon further research, investigators discovered that several children had drowned in a nearby creek, along with other children hanging themselves in the attic. So there was certainly a ton of tortured ghosts still trying to haunt anyone that took ownership of a home that was once their own. In at number 9, Annabelle. Let's face it, nobody is fearless when it comes down to a doll that's possessed. The very thought that an inanimate object could come to life is terrifying all on its own. Little did people know while watching this 2014 supernatural film that it was all based on a true story. Although the movie version of the doll was dramatically different from the real-life Raggedy Ann doll, the story remains the same. After being purchased in 1970 at a hobby shop by a mother as a gift for her daughter, Annabelle's brutal attacks began. It wasn't so much the doll itself committing these horrific acts, but the spirit that was infused within it. The most famous case of an Annabelle attack was when a young man and his girlfriend were visiting the doll's enclosure in a museum. They were seen banging on the glass and mocking the doll before being kicked out. Shortly thereafter, the man lost control of his motorcycle and crashed it into a tree head on. In at number 8, The Exorcism of Emily Rose. That's right, IO fans, I saw your comments saying, what about The Exorcism of Emily Rose? And you were 100% right. I had to include it in this list. In the film, a 19-year-old teen named Emily Rose dies after self-inflicted wounds after an exorcism was performed on her. The priest who performed the exorcism ends up being arrested and charged, so the movie mainly follows that plus a few flashbacks of Emily's life. In real life, the teen's name was Annalise Michel, a German woman who had been diagnosed with epileptic psychosis, leading to a lot of psychiatric treatment for her random seizures. Over time, Annalise became obsessed with the idea that she was actually possessed by a demon. Although her cause of death was believed to be from the exorcism, it was actually starvation combined with dehydration. Regardless, her parents and the Catholic priest were all found guilty of negligent homicide. In at number 7, Blackwater. This 2007 horror film was meant to do for crocodiles what Jaws did for the great white shark. It's an Australian tale inspired from the real-life attacks that were happening in the outback. For the movie, we see a group of friends taking a ride out on a fishing boat when a giant crocodile attacks them from out of nowhere. Its true story counterpart is similar in that the crocodile did come out of nowhere in an area that many have said they don't go. Back in 2003, a group of friends decided to race their quad bikes near the Kangaroo Flats. Thanks to monsoon rains though, the area was quickly transformed into the perfect spot for a croc. A crocodile then attacked a man in their group, causing the other friends to run up a tree and wait until help arrived, while the crocodile was just kind of circling underneath them. Terrifying. In at number 6, Poltergeist. This 1982 supernatural horror film was set in a California suburb and focused in on a family that was being tormented by ghosts in their own home. Although the true events that inspired such a highly acclaimed scary movie actually took place in 1958 in Seaford, New York. The Herman family became known around the world after claiming to have experienced poltergeist activity in their house. The family reported that while staying in the home, they witnessed small pieces of furniture and even her brother's globe that began flying around the house. What's even crazier was that these ghostly encounters all took place in a home that was only 5 to 7 miles from the famous house in Amityville. Coincidence? I think not. In at number 5, The Disappointments Room. This 2016 psychological horror film was first inspired by an HGTV episode from a segment called If Walls Could Talk. It didn't do so hot in the box office though, it only made $5 million, yet it spent close to $15 million. I mean, how disappointing. Aside from the film's commercial failure, it was actually based on a true story. The whole premise of the movie is that this female architect buys a home and discovers a secret room in the attic. The real story is very similar and involves a woman from Rhode Island that finds this separated room on the 3rd floor of her house. The room wasn't locked, but surprisingly there was a deadbolt on the outside of the door. To make things even creepier, the woman also discovered that the flooring in the room was made of metal. After doing some research, she discovers that the judge had built the 19th century home and he would lock his disabled daughter in the secret room. This is a perfect example of a movie just not doing justice to the actual story. In at number 4, The Possession. This scary movie centers around a family that purchases this old wooden box with Hebrew letters engraved on it from a yard sale. The family is fascinated by it because they also can't seem to open the box. One night his daughter starts to hear whispering coming from the box and she tries to open it again and actually manages to pop the lid off this time. Inside of the box was a tooth, a dead moth, a wooden figurine, and a ring that she then starts to wear. Later we discover that what she actually released was an evil spirit called Debuk. Debuk is a malevolent wandering spirit that enters and possesses the body of a living person until exorcised. The history of the spirit can actually be found in the Torah, and the box itself was a real item that was brought to America from a survivor of the Holocaust. People on set didn't even want to be near it, and shortly after filming the movie, a strange series of events started happening. A neon light exploded randomly next to the screenwriter, and 5 days after wrapping, the building that was the storage house for props mysteriously burned to the ground.
It is a real thing in the Torah that it speaks about different types of demons that can attach themselves to a person.
In at number 3, Winchester. Starring Helen Mirren, the side-by-side of her and the actual woman the movie is based on is absolutely stunning. It follows the life of a woman named Sarah Winchester, the widow of a famous weapons manufacturer. Due to the death of her husband and her daughter before that, Sarah suddenly had a $20 million inheritance, but also felt cursed by the ghosts of those who had died at the hands of what her husband had created. She begins constructing this massive home in California where the reclusive heir would live out most of her life. The real-life Sarah was thought to be insane insane as she would constantly draw up new renovations and expansions for the Victorian mansion that she said were all directed by these evil spirits. And before Houdini ever became a famous magician, he focused on debunking fake spiritualists and mediums. When he heard about this woman named Sarah Winchester, he had to visit her home. Even the great Houdini himself could not shake the sense that something inside the home was wrong. He then dubbed the building the Winchester Mystery House. In at number 2, The Town That Dreaded Sundown. This American slasher film was released back in 1976 and was loosely based on the Texarkana Moonlight murders. These murders took place throughout 1946 in Texarkana, Texas, although the movie decided to place them in Arkansas just because it was kind of close to the border there. Regardless, the film's portrayal of a mysterious mass serial killer was very real. This man, who was named by the Texarkana Gazette as the Phantom Killer, would go on random crime sprees, attacking 8 people and killing 5 all in the dead of night. Due to the fact that the killer was never found, the advertising team for this movie took artistic license when they released the film. The film's tagline was, "And he still lurks the streets of Texarkana." This caused a lot of uproar in the local community, especially considering that some of the victims' families were still alive. It also angered the police in that area, who now had a movie discrediting their work in trying to track down this killer. Last but not least, in our number 1 spot, The Sacrament. This 2013 found footage thriller film follows these Vice journalists who document a co-worker's attempt to track down her sister after she joins a religious commune. Although set in a more present day time, its plot was inspired by the real life events of the Jonestown Massacre in 1978. It highlights how extreme ideologies and a charismatic leader can lead people into doing the unthinkable. Jim Jones called his cult the People's Temple, and on the settlement in Guyana where he led his followers, Jones would go on to commit the largest mass suicide in history, killing more than 900 of his followers by giving them this Kool-Aid laced with rat poison. In at number 10, Scream. This 1996 American slasher film was directed by the great Wes Craven approximately 6 years following the real-life shocking events the movie is based on. It's said that this movie was what revitalized the horror genre in the 90s, but the writers can't take all of the credit. The movie's antagonist is actually based on a man dubbed the Gainesville Ripper. His name was Danny Harold Rawling, and during the summer of 1990 in Gainesville, Florida, Danny took the lives of 5 students. The majority of the film follows teens being watched by this masked killer while at home, which is what triggers paranoia for people that have watched this movie. In real life, Danny would actually break into several local homes, then bind these teens with tape before brutally killing them. His disturbing, idiosyncratic approach to murder shook the community and led to many students dropping out of nearby schools as panic ensued. In at number 9, Bonnie and Clyde. The 1967 film titled Bonnie and Clyde was essentially a biographical crime film that told the story of this nefarious couple from their perspective. While they may lend some feelings of sympathy, it's difficult to look past the atrocities that these two actually committed. The film did get one thing right with their ending, which is still considered to be one of the bloodiest death scenes in cinematic history. It's a simplified version of Bonnie and Clyde and their gang that wreaked havoc on small shop owners, gas stations, and a string of robberies. They were also found guilty of killing a total of 9 police officers as well as multiple civilians. The film, however, portrayed these shocking crimes in a very comedic manner that aroused a ton of controversy. The filmmakers were just glorifying murderers. In at number 8, Bully. This 2001 American crime film directed by Larry Clark follows a group of teens living in South Florida that plot the murder of a friend who they consider to be the biggest bully in their group. The movie drew its inspiration though from the real-life murder of Bobby Kent in 1993. Throughout the film and in real life, Bobby's friends had confessed to each other that Kent was being very abusive towards them. Ultimately, they arrived at the odd conclusion that he had to be eliminated. The group was referred to as the Broward County 7, and together they conspired a way to lure their bully into a car where one of them was planning on killing him with their mother's pistol. They realized soon that they couldn't go through with it, but still wanted him gone from their lives. Instead, they hired a hitman to help them carry out this shocking crime that they too participated in later on. In at number 7, Devil's Knot. The 2013 American biographical crime drama film was actually first based on the Mara Leveret book with the same name. Both are based on the real-life shocking story of 3 children who were murdered and the teens that were convicted. They were known as the West Memphis 3. Damien Eccles was sentenced to death, Jesse Miskelly Jr. and Jason Baldwin though would receive life in prison. It was believed that these juvenile delinquents murdered these innocent children as part of some sort of satanic ritual. The horrific crimes even led to what was called the Satanic Panic that spread across the United States and many parts of the world by the late 90s. In at number 6, Ted Bundy. In the most recent Netflix release called Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil and Vile, we saw the dramatic retelling of the Ted Bundy murders and trial. There have actually been 6 films though based on Ted Bundy's murderous rampage and plea of innocence. There was Bundy, an American Icon, The Capture of the Green River Killer, The Deliberate Stranger, The Riverman, and one simply titled Ted Bundy. One may think that this is too many movies idolizing a killer, but in reality it's important to chronicle that no matter how charming someone may seem, they could also be hiding a demon like Ted Bundy was. Beyond killing at least 30 women, Bundy was also a master manipulator that through some sort of psychopathic seduction convinced his girlfriend that he was innocent the whole time. In at number 5, Dahmer. Directed by David Jacobson and starring Jeremy Renner, the film is a biographical true crime horror film about the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, a man that was responsible for the bizarre and horrendous murders of 17 men. Dahmer would meet men in gay bars and after bringing them home would drug his victims before killing and dismembering them. Dahmer was a uniquely disturbed individual that would often keep things like his victims' skulls as some sort of weird trophy for his trouble. Dahmer wasn't even arrested until 1991 when one of his victims named Tracy Edwards managed to escape and lead the police back to his apartment. Inside they discovered that Dahmer was very meticulous with his recordings of each murder, even taking photos of the deceased bodies. Yuck. In at number 4, Zodiac. This 2007 mystery thriller film, directed by David Fincher and largely followed police investigators as they scrambled to find the Zodiac killer before he struck again. Sounds like a classic movie trope, but in reality all of this actually played out. There was indeed a man that called himself the Zodiac killer that spent most of his time sending encrypted letters to the San Francisco Chronicle threatening to kill more people unless his message was decoded. To this day, the real killer was never found, and it's believed that between the 1960s to late 1970s, he was able to get away with up to 37 murders. In at number 3, The Teacup Poisoner. I'll never understand why filmmakers feel the need to turn horrific crimes into a dark comedy, but that's what they did when telling the story of Graham Young, the Teacup Murderer. Following the notorious killer's life since early childhood, they showed that Graham had a fascination with chemistry and dreamt of poisoning people. As many people as possible, really. Graham's first victims were his own family, and after poisoning them without killing them, he was sent to Broadmoor Hospital. Then, as soon as he was released in 1971, he would go on to poison 7 more people, killing 2 of them. As the name would suggest, he would do this via serving cups of tea to his victims. In at number 2, The Amityville Horror. This is yet again another film that was first based on a book by the same name. The 1979 horror film chronicles the alleged experiences of the Lutz family upon buying a home that a mass murder was committed in the previous year. That last piece of detail though is based on the real life events. The killer's name was Ronald DeFeo Jr., a 23-year-old man from Amityville, Long Island. It's a very mysterious case still to this day. After Ronald had killed 6 members of his family, he went to a bar declaring that he needed help because someone had shot his parents. Each of the victims were found lying face down in their beds with apparent gunshot wounds that led to their deaths. Originally his story was that a mobster hitman had killed them, but as time went on his story began to have too many inconsistencies, which eventually led investigators back to Ronald as their prime suspect. Last but not least, at our number 1 spot, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. This 1986 psychological horror film is about the random crime spree committed by a serial killer who had been acting with absolute impunity. This killer was Henry Lee Lucas, and throughout the 60s and 70s he would go on to commit a number of murders, and by the early 80s we learned just how many. Henry was convicted of 11 homicides, but he would also claim to have killed upwards of 3,000 people. However, after some investigation it was found that Lucas had been kind of stretching the truth on that last part just a little bit. The film is primarily based though on Henry's confessions and fantasies though instead of just straight facts.